In this video, we're going to be talking about le passé composé, or the past tense. What is le passé composé? Well, in French, we use this verb tense to represent things that happened in the past. Passé referring to the past, and composé refers to a verb tense being composed of two verbs. An auxiliary verb and the action verb. In English, when we want to express things that happened in the past, we usually tag on an ed to the end of the verb we are trying to express. In this example, I walked, we have a subject and a verb in the past participle. Ed is most common in English for words like talked, closed, kicked, but in French, we don't have the ed ending to represent things that happened in the past. Instead, we use the sentence structure for le passé composé. That sentence structure, for that sentence structure, we need a subject, an auxiliary verb, plus the action verb that we are referring to. And that action verb has to have a past participle, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. For auxiliary verbs, you're only going to ever have two options. You're either going to have avoir as your auxiliary, which means to have, and être, which means to be. What is a past participle? A past participle is a different form of a verb indicating the past tense. In English, like we mentioned, we typically use ed at the end of the verb, although there are many irregularities, such as ate or even said. In French, your past participle will depend on what type of verb you have. In French, we typically have four types of verbs. We have verbs ending in er, we have verbs ending in ir, we have verbs ending in re, and then we have our irregular verbs. When you are expressing an er verb in the past tense, you will change the ending er to an e with an apostrophe, an accent. If you are expressing a verb that ends in ir in the past tense, you would change the ending to an I. If you are expressing a verb with the ending re in the past tense, you would change it to a u. And that'll come in handy when we put sentences together. Let's talk about auxiliary verbs, which are absolutely necessary if you want to be able to express le passé composé. There are two auxiliary verbs you will ever use when expressing the passé composé. As I said, they are avoir and être. It's important that you know how to conjugate both avoir and être in the present tense in order to express the past tense. For now, most verbs can be expressed using the auxiliary avoir. There are only 16 verbs that you would conjugate with the verb être. So let's first take a look at avoir. I have the conjugations here. So let's take a look at our passé composé formula. If I wanted to express in English, she walked, and wanted to express it in French, this is how I would do it. First, I would take the subject, she. In French, we use elle. And then the auxiliary verb, because walked in French, marcher, is a verb that you would use with the auxiliary avoir. We conjugate elle with avoir. So if we look at our conjugation chart here, avoir conjugated with elle is a. So elle a, and then the verb to walk was marcher. But if we remember our past participles, marcher is an ER verb. So we would change the ending to an E with an accent. Elle a marché. We have our subject here, our auxiliary here, and our verb, it's a past participle here. Let's look at être. You will only ever use être as your auxiliary verb when referring to 16 transformative verbs. A transformative verb is basically a full body movement, with some exceptions, of course, because in French there's exceptions for literally everything. So, you only use être as the auxiliary for these words. It's probably in your best interest to memorize them, and the best way I think to memorize them is with the acronym Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp. So all of these transformative verbs you would use with être, not avoir. But we still need to know how to conjugate être in the present tense in order to represent le passé composé. If I wanted to translate or express you all left, this is how I would do it. We would still use the same passé composé formula. So our subject is actually you all. So we would use vous. Now we go to our formula. We see that we need the auxiliary verb left. Next, because we're working with left, left in French is partir, and that is a verb you would express with être. So we would go to the conjugation in present tense for vous, which is être. And then left in French is partir. And because, if we remember our past participles, partir is an IR verb, so we would change the ending to just an I. Vous êtes partis, you all left. Now, something else to keep in mind, that doesn't really have to do with le passé composé, but is important to know in French, is le liaison between these two sounds here, the S and the E. Typically in French, you don't pronounce the last S in the word, but because the next word begins with a vowel, you do pronounce the S, and you almost say these two words as if they were one. You would say vous êtes partis instead of vous êtes partis. Let's look at some more examples. If I wanted to call out my friend for eating my apple and say, you ate my apple. The first thing we would do is take the subject, you, in this case it's singular, so we would use tu. Ate, that's the verb manger, and if we look at our Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp verbs, manger is not on here. That means we conjugate it with the auxiliary verb avoir. You can use this for reference. So if we go to our avoir conjugation, we know that tu is conjugated with avoir as a. And then to eat is manger, but because it is an ER verb, we would take off the ER and replace it with an E with an accent. And then ma pomme. If I wanted to say I fell, I would first take the subject, which is je. Now to fall is tomber, so first we need to check our être auxiliary verbs, and we see that tomber is here, meaning that we're going to use the verb être as the auxiliary. Je, conjugated with être, is suis. Je suis. And then to fall, as we said, was tomber. But again, this is an ER verb, so we change the ending ER to just an E with an accent. Merci d'avoir regardé. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this helped you be able to express yourself better in French. À plus tard.